You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 27th of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, reactions to the NATO summit continue. We'll get the perspective from New Zealand. It is 18:28 in Wellington, 7:28 here in London. At this week's NATO summit in The Hague, New Zealand's Christopher Luxon stood alone among Indo-Pacific allies. Although not a member of NATO, New Zealand has been invited to attend as part of a tailored partnership programme with the alliance, meaning they cooperate on various security issues. Japan's Prime Minister Kishida cancelled his attendance, while South Korea and Australia had already decided to boycott the gathering. So I'm joined now by Geoffrey Miller, who's a geopolitical analyst with the Democracy Project in New Zealand. Geoffrey, thanks for coming on the show. I wonder if you could just start by explaining New Zealand's relationship with NATO and how that works.
Yes, good evening to you from New Zealand. Good morning to you in London. New Zealand has attended NATO summits now for 4 years running, and Christopher Luxon is the third successive New Zealand Prime Minister to do so. Jacinda Ardern went to the NATO summit in Madrid back in 2022, and it's very much been a development after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and New Zealand has taken a more security-focused, more hawkish view of the world, I think, since that time. So I think that's one of the big drivers here for Christopher Luxon to be going. It's that broader change in New Zealand's foreign policy. The other reason, though, is simply it's a good chance to meet a lot of world leaders in one place. And you have to remember, New Zealand is a small country of 5 million people at the bottom of the world. It doesn't get invited to a lot of these big summits. It's not part of the G7 or G20. It doesn't get invitations, even in the way that Australia does. Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, was a guest at the G7, for example, in Canada. So I think getting that face time is one of the reasons that Christopher Luxon has used to justify his participation. And he certainly got some good face time there with Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, Mark Carney, the new Canadian Prime Minister, and Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, the Ukrainian president. And these are leaders that he just wouldn't normally get to meet.
Why was New Zealand alone amongst Indo-Pacific countries in attending?
Well, in some ways, by virtue of circumstances, really. Christopher Luxon announced his trip a couple of weeks ago, and it was part of a two-part international trip. He went to China, first of all, and it was a very interesting sequencing here, going to China to meet Xi Jinping and then flying direct from Beijing to Europe to attend the NATO summit. And so it was an interesting juxtapositioning there. And he was kind of committed to going to NATO. The other leaders, notably the Japanese Prime Minister and the South Korean President, withdrew really over the weekend, and Christopher Luxon was already there. It would have been quite awkward for him to withdraw at that point. And so I think that's why he went through with it. But it was a quite different summit, I think, than he was expecting, because he didn't get to he didn't have the chance to have his meeting with the other IP4 leaders, as they're called in NATO, and he didn't get certainly a meeting with Trump, and that was the hope, I think, that Donald Trump would have had a meeting with the at least three of the IP4 leaders. Anthony Albanese from Australia was never, I think, confirmed as going, but the other two certainly were. But in the end, it didn't happen, and Christopher Luxon ended up with more lower-level meetings when it came to the IP4.
Is New Zealand bound by the demand to increase defence spending, and what's Luxon said about that?
No, look, New Zealand is a NATO partner, very much not a NATO member, and Christopher Luxon has emphasised that himself. He's been saying, look, NATO is really about Europe. It's quite interesting. He's almost been dialing back a bit New Zealand's links with NATO, and I think that is in part because of the pressure going on to increase defence spending up to that 5% level, which is an enormous sum. New Zealand has made some big steps in recent months towards increasing its defence spending, and it announced a new defence capability plan back in April that will see it spending another $5 billion US dollars in defence over the next 4 years. So New Zealand will get up to that 2% level that has traditionally been NATO's target by the early 2030s. And that's a big step for New Zealand, because at the moment the defence spending has been around half of that level. So that's already a big shift for New Zealand. And I think Christopher Luxon will say, well, look, we're already doing our bit. and we can't really afford to spend a lot more at the moment. Let's get up to 2% first, and then let's see. And the other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, that juxtapositioning of Christopher Luxon's trip, and China certainly is very much the target here of NATO. That's why Christopher Luxon really is being invited from NATO's perspective. NATO sees China now as part of its remit, and it wants to contain China. So New Zealand and the IP4 members are really being brought into NATO to support NATO's programmes against China. And that is a risky business for New Zealand, because China is New Zealand's biggest trading partner by some margin. Around a third of New Zealand exports go to China every year. All the meat, all the dairy products that New Zealand exports, a large proportion of those do go to China now. And as we've seen in the past few months, the United States has been introducing new tariffs, and we're not really seeing open markets when it comes to New Zealand's Western partners, even though they like to talk about solidarity when it comes to the security situation. And New Zealand also has a free trade agreement with the EU, but there are real limitations on that, and still tariffs in place, even though it's a free trade agreement, quote unquote. But New Zealand is facing still 7.5% tariffs, with a relatively small quota of 10,000 tonnes of beef that it's allowed to export into the European Union, for example.
Jeffrey, thank you very much indeed. That's Jeffrey Miller, geopolitical analyst with the Democracy Project in Wellington. This is Monocle Radio.